Snow whispered against the roof of the old barn, the wind howling through the timbers. Like a ghost mourning the lost. Souls of the prairie, and under that gray sky walked a woman wrapped in grief and dust. A widow whose eyes no longer knew warmth. Her name was Clara Hensley, and 3 weeks ago, she'd buried her husband with her own trembling, hands on the edge of a forgotten town that didn't care to remember her. The world had turned cold, cruel, and endless, and as her carriage broke down on the frozen road, she had stumbled upon the sprawling Dunridge Ranch, a place that looked as if it too had seen better days. The man who owned it was known simply as Rhett Callahan, a rancher carved from stone and silence, his presence heavier than the winter itself. When she knocked on his door seeking shelter, he opened it without a word, his steel-gray eyes sweeping over her worn shawl, her trembling hands, and the hollow sorrow that had settled deep inside her chest. "You can stay," he said at last, voice low and firm. "But this ain't a charity house." She nodded, grateful even for his rough kindness, and followed him inside where the air smelled faintly of coffee, smoke, and leather. The fire burned in the hearth, but she stood far from it, as though afraid to melt the ice she'd grown used to carrying in her bones. Later that night, when he showed her the spare room, she shook her head. "I'll sleep in the barn," she murmured softly, her eyes lowered. "I don't want to trouble you." Rhett turned slowly, the lamplight glinting off his unshaven jaw, and in that moment something ancient and protective stirred in him. A quiet anger that she thought herself unworthy of a bed, of warmth, of decency. "You'll do no such thing," he said gruffly, his hand tightening on the lantern handle. "You'll sleep inside, next to me or not at all." His words hung between them, bold and unyielding, shocking her into stillness. She blinked up at him, unable to breathe, unsure whether to be frightened or moved. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm a widow. My husband's barely cold in the ground." Rhett's gaze softened for the first time, pain flashing through it like lightning through storm clouds. "And I'm not asking for your hand, ma'am," he said quietly. "Just making sure you don't freeze to death out. They're trying to prove something. No one's asking you to prove." He turned then, leaving her standing in the flickering light, his boots echoing down the hall. But the weight of his words burned in her chest long after he was gone. That night she lay awake in the small room he'd given her, hearing the wind tear at the eaves, hearing the horses shift restlessly in their stalls, and wondering who Rhett Callahan really was. The next morning came slow and gray. The snow piled deep across the ranch yard, and Rhett was already out feeding the cattle, his breath turning to steam in the frozen air. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter and stepped outside, the cold biting her skin, the scent of hay and frost mixing in the morning stillness. She wanted to thank him, but the words felt clumsy and small compared to the debt she owed him for his kindness. When she approached, he barely glanced at her. "You can cook?" he asked, as if the question were a simple fact of life. "Yes," she said, her pride flickering faintly. "Then we'll eat by noon." And that was that. Day by day, Clara began to learn the rhythm of the ranch, the creak of the barn doors, the calls of cattle in the valley, the whistle of the wind through the pines. She scrubbed floors, mended clothes, and stirred stew over the fire, trying not to notice the way Rhett watched her, sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice carried a quiet strength that made her feel safe even when he said nothing kind at all. One evening she found him outside repairing the fence, the sunset bleeding across the snow like spilled wine. "You work too hard," she said softly, her breath misting. "So do you," he answered without looking up. "That's what keeps the ghosts quiet." She frowned, unsure what he meant, and he gave a half smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Lost my wife 4 winters ago," he said simply. "Fever took her and the baby. Buried them both out back near the cottonwoods." The wind seemed to hold its breath, and Clara felt her heart twist. 2 broken souls standing in the cold, each hiding wounds that never healed. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "So am I," he replied. After that night, something changed between them. He stopped keeping his distance, and she stopped pretending she didn't care. When he came in from the fields, she'd have hot coffee waiting. And when she sat by the fire at night, he'd sometimes sit beside her in silence, the crackle of flames filling the spaces where words dared not go. Still, her heart warred against itself. Part of her still belonged to the man she'd buried, and part of her feared that if she reached for warmth again, It might vanish like smoke in the wind. Then came the night the storm hit, the kind that buried the prairie in white and howled like wolves outside the windows. The roof rattled, the barn creaked, and Rhett came in covered in snow, his eyes wild with worry. "The barn door's jammed," he said. "We'll have to wait it out." She nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter. But the firewood was running low and the temperature dropped fast. He looked at her, then at the small cot she'd insisted on using in the corner of the room, and his jaw set. "You'll freeze there," he said firmly. She shook her head. "I'll be fine." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "No, you won't." She looked up at him, defiant and trembling, and he said the words again, slower, softer, filled with something more than command. "You'll sleep next to me, or not at all." The silence that followed wasn't cold. It was charged, alive, trembling with unspoken truths neither of them had the courage to name. He